Welcome to the Practical Enneagram. The Process Enneagram is a different application of the Enneagram symbol, so different from the Enneagram of personality. When you bring the Process Enneagram as a view alongside the Enneagram of personality, things just start to make a lot more sense in terms of customizing a developmental approach for ourselves, for our clients. Lucille Greeff is one of the only humans I know teaching this sophisticated application of the Enneagram. Lucille is a chartered Organisational Development Practitioner, Facilitator, coach, team development and Enneagram specialist, and poet based in South Africa. Her company is Euphoria Partners. Definitely look her up. I loved speaking with Lucille, clearly ridiculously smart, and she really clarified some of the questions I've been holding about this whole process Enneagram dealio, which at this stage I'm just attempting to get clear on for myself rather than having this be an active lens in my coaching practice. I hope that you enjoy this interview. Lucille, thank you for being here and for taking the time.
It's lovely to be here.
I'd love to hear how the Enneagram came into your life and how your work with it has changed over the years.
The Enneagram came into my life in a fairly haphazard way. In the early 2000s, I joined a small boutique consultancy, and a very fierce Enneagram 8 that I still work with said to me, if you want to work on projects with me and you don't know the Enneagram, I won't work with you. But I really wanted to work with her. So I went and thought, I'll go and find out about this thing, whatever it is. I can learn new frameworks. I'll do that. But I wasn't expecting it to be meaningful at all. It was just a tick box to get into working with this more experienced consultant, Julia. And then I met the Enneagram. So it was kind of unexpected. And it really helped me to understand a lot of the dysfunctional patterns in my own relationship dynamics in my intimate life, first and foremost. And I thought, wow, anything that can help me figure out what the hell I'm doing there is definitely worthwhile studying more. So at that point, I started taking my Enneagram education quite seriously and have ever since. And it's been lovely to learn from teachers all across the globe and to also start teaching the Enneagram. So a lot of my work involves teaching the Enneagram to coaches and therapists and other people in the helping professions these days. I've also had the privilege of building more than one Enneagram assessment over the years, figuring out how to measure something that lives in the unconscious as an operating system, I think is an interesting challenge that's tickled my fancy. And over the years, I have noticed how my way of working in my own work with the Enneagram has changed significantly. I think in the early years when I was just learning about the framework, a lot of it was around looking in a mirror and seeing myself more clearly. It's almost like going from a smoky mirror to a clear mirror over time. I'm a lot more interested these days in the Enneagram as a map, and that's what we'll be talking about as well. So the process Enneagram and how the Enneagram shows us maybe some paths that are well trodden and some secret pathways. Some magical pathways from point X to point Y in some way. So that's one of the ways I think my work with the Enneagram has changed. The second way, and it has to do with vertical development and different stages of development. When I first built an assessment and a report to work with the Enneagram, I came from very much a technical specializing kind of point of view, where I thought that our job was to kind of write user manuals for human beings. And right now, I've moved so far from that perspective that I think there is use for that way of working. But I'm a lot more interested in writing, for example, assessment reports that are conversation starters. That help us with the developmental rhythm of disrupting and containing, but not overwhelming people, and really being very client-centered around the way in which we write things, as opposed to almost writing those technical manuals for coaches so that they don't have to think. So I'm very interested in working with the Enneagram in more mature ways.
Do you think that's a natural progression, to go from using the Enneagram of personality to go to using it from a more process way, or do you think that that's an individual thing?
I think it's some people have come into the Enneagram through the work of Gurdjieff, having only worked with the Process Enneagram and not with a personality Enneagram at all. I think in the broader coaching world, it's like the lesser spotted animal in some way. It's few and far between. The more natural progression is to work with a personality Enneagram. And if we progress, to then start working with the Process Enneagram as well. Although I think for a lot of people, the personality Enneagram is enough.
Yeah.
I guess as seekers, the question is, what are we seeking? Mirrors or map?
Yeah. And how do you relate to the Enneagram of personality now? Just curious.
I think over the years, I've fallen in and out of love with the Enneagram many, many times, the Enneagram of personality. And I'm really most of the time led by what's useful for the clients that I work with. And what my observation is that when we're trying to go from being asleep to starting to wake up, the Enneagram of personality is incredibly helpful at early stages of our vertical development journey. And so given that that's where most human beings are, is asleep or half asleep or only recently woken up, there's real value in the Enneagram of personality. I do sometimes get a little bit jaded by the way in which we use it to box people, or the way in which it's used to, in some way, excuse non-development when it starts getting used where people say, oh, I'm an Enneagram 8, so this is just who I am. People should deal. I'm not very fond of those ways of working with the Enneagram. And there is such depth and richness inside the Enneagram of personality that I still work with it for myself and for others. I just think we need to hold it lightly, like any framework. From an existential perspective, it's useful to remember that a framework's just a framework. Yeah. And there are times when that framework's useful and times when we absolutely should let it go.
Interesting. Thank you. Okay, so onto the topic in hand. Well, what is vertical development first? What does that even mean?
So vertical development is the process over time that we all as human beings go through that allows us to progressively see and take in and respond to more and more of the world around us. I think we know vertical development a lot better in childhood development because we see it in children. We see the difference between a little baby that can't even walk or talk, that then goes and sees and meets more of the world as they learn how to speak and learn how to walk around, all the way through to teenagers that kind of start finding their own way and their own transport even in the world. It's kind of a very concrete way of thinking about it. So we watch our children go through these different stages in their developmental journeys, and they are distinct and different and unique. I think part of what we forget is that as adults, that process continues, but maybe becomes a bit more abstract and harder to map because our physical bodies have stopped growing in some kind of way. So it's all happening on the inside. So over time, if we continue to develop, our paradigms are framed and reframed. One of the metaphors that I find very helpful to think about vertical development is thinking of a glass. So if you think of a glass that holds 250 milliliters of water, if we're doing something and the opposite to vertical development would be horizontal development. If we're doing horizontal development, we're just adding new interesting things into this glass. But it's essentially the same glass with the same capacity. We can add ice blocks, we can add slices of cucumber, little mint leaves, whatever we want to, but that's the size of the container. That's how much it can take. When we go through a process of vertical development, that actual container becomes a bigger vessel. So suddenly I can take in more of the world and there's more space inside me. Now, some of the things that we grow and develop through have to do with our capacity for complexity. So it can be quite cognitive. Sometimes I can only deal with so many variables, but I can bring in more and more nonlinear relationships and work with the complexity of the world and not try and simplify it over time as I grow and mature vertically. Some of it has to do with emotional intelligence. Some of it has to do with moral development. There's so many strands that come together inside vertical development. I guess the sad thing is that for many of us, we kind of stop developing significantly, often by the age of 27. It's like we kind of try and replicate the paradigm or worldview that we inherited from our primary caregivers. And when we get there, we think we're done, or where popular culture takes us. So it actually, beyond a certain point, takes active engagement with a developmental journey to continue to vertically develop rather than getting stuck at some point.
Vertical development is not a given. Many people don't. And what's the usual sort of fuel for beginning engaging an adult vertical development journey?
I think in the early stages of our developmental journeys, life will deal us with invitations to develop. Some of them will be grand opportunities, kind of getting a job that requires a way of thinking and being in the world that's way beyond your capacity. And somehow you have to figure out how to do it. But that's actually not the most frequent version to it. Traumas, losses, setbacks, disappointments, those things are the more common fodder or invitations for vertical development. So, when we get ill, when we get retrenched, when our parents get ill and pass away, all of those things almost have the invitation to say, hey, your world's changed. Are you going to change with it? And sometimes we take those opportunities and sometimes we don't. So in the early stages, life will give us invitations. I think when we start getting to what many will call the post-conventional stages of maturity, that's where the active engagement with continuous growth needs to come from. And some of that has to do with the discipline of spiritual practices, seeking teachers that confuse us, and other heat experiences. We can only grow if we continue to be disrupted in some way, and then find new ways of making sense of that or containing our lives and our worldviews. But if we wrap ourselves in cotton wool, it's very hard to keep growing.
Makes sense. There's got to be some friction, and then at some point that needs to be generated by us, that friction. So how has vertical development traditionally been contextualized when it comes to the Enneagram?
I think in general, vertical development has been contextualized in a very well-intentioned and spiritual way, mostly, not necessarily a deeply psychologically informed way of thinking about it. So different teachers think about that journey and even name the journey different things. It's the journey of integration, the journey of development, the journey of the development of consciousness, the levels of health. I mean, there's so many ways in which we traditionally think about it. And there are also different levels of complexity that's offered inside that frame, whether it's Ginger Lappert-Bogda saying, are you at low, medium or high levels of development, or something more complex like the Riso and Hudson 9 levels of development that kind of stretch from at the bottom unhealthy levels, the level of pathological destructiveness, all the way to the very healthy levels of liberation. And so there's been descriptive work done inside the Enneagram of personality to say at different levels, your style will look differently and this is how it might look. But I think for most of the Enneagram community, we haven't thought a lot about how. How do we go from level 9 to level 8, or from unhealthy to average levels of health in some kind of way? And I think that's where there's a much smaller group of Enneagram teachers that are thinking about the process of vertical development in some kind of way. And I think the people who have thought about it most, other than, of course, Gurdjieff himself and Oscar Ishazo's work in this field, that's maybe less accessible for everyday people, would be, at the present moment, the work being done by Uranio Paez and Beatrice Chestnut. Although I think if we go back to the work of Sandra Maitri and others, there is this story that emerges, which has to do with kind of working from the distorted instincts into the balanced instincts, with the higher heart center working from the vice or the passion of the type to the virtue. And there's a bit that's being spoken about around the vice to virtue conversion. And then in the higher mental center, the process of loosening the hold of the fixated ideas and starting to access the holy ideas of the different types. So that would be, I think, the kind of traditional way in which we think about it. But even that story is not told that often. Work more with descriptive stages rather than saying, so how do I convert a vice into a virtue? How do I change my fixated idea into this very abstract notion of the holy idea, which is very hard to work with in some way?
Yeah, there's just not much talk of a sequence, is there? The first first time I came across that idea of a sequence was with Uranio Paez. And okay, so what is the Process Enneagram, and what is the Process Enneagram view of vertical development?
So the Process Enneagram is the ugly stepsister of the Personality Enneagram in some way. So the Process Enneagram is the way in which we can use the Enneagram that's distinctly different from saying Enneagram 1 represents the motivation of wanting to be a good person who does the right thing, and 2 means this and 3 means that, where it becomes steps in a journey. And there are 2 ways in which we can navigate the steps in the journey. The first is on the circle. So the outer circle that goes 9, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's more of a sequential, normal time way of thinking about steps in a process. And if you take any kind of project from start to finish, there's a way in which you can say phase 1 was this, phase 2 was this, phase 3 was that. And likewise, you can use that Enneagram map to then sequentially think about how to break up a process. And there are certain points in that circular journey, specifically at 3 and 6, that we call shock points. So that's where something normally significantly changes or is reframed in some kind of way. But otherwise, we're working sequentially around the Enneagram. The inner hexad and triangle of the Enneagram, so the inner symbol of the Enneagram, represents a process that is not necessarily sequential, but more in, I'll use a weird word here, magical time, or non-linear time, if we want to talk complexity language. So a way of thinking about a process in a non-linear way that, as with complexity theory, can then create interesting consequences that aren't necessarily foreseeable when we're working in linear time, as the outer circle would represent. So that's what the Process Enneagram is about. And if you want to work with the Enneagram as a whole, you almost have to see the Personality Enneagram and the Process Enneagram as both being in conversation with each other. And when you bring them into conversation with each other, the map of the Enneagram starts making a lot more sense than when you're just working with the one side.
It seems to me that the Process Enneagram offers a more precise way to inform the developmental priorities than the Personality of Enneagram. From a perspective of working with clients, we're looking at typing them effectively, getting the Enneagram of personality lens clear, and then also looking at where they potentially are in the Process Enneagram, using the first application you described, the linear one.
Yes, so that's a really good starting point. If we want an accurate sense of our client and who they are, together with what work is helpful, what kind of transitions and paradigm shifts are helpful to this person and which ones are not, because actually it's too far advanced or it's not, it's territory they've already covered, then it's really useful to also know where they are in that sequence or stage map around the outer ring of the Enneagram and the Process Enneagram. Absolutely.
And given what you said earlier, which is, I think, irrefutably true, that most people will encounter, including us actually, are going to be at point 1 or point 2. What sort of activities are we looking at, or is that type specific for points 1 and points 2? Sorry, not levels.
I think there are some things that are universal. And there are some things that are specific to our Enneagram style. And that's why I say you have to bring the 2 together in some kind of way. So if we're working on the universal aspects of waking up, so for a moment, I'll use Enneagram language, and then I might use some more integral, existentially informed language from a psychological perspective alongside it.
Right.
So inside the Enneagram itself, if I'm in that space where I'm in the trance, I'm asleep, I'm living my life, but I don't yet have the position of the inner observer in place. So I can't see myself, and I'm not questioning in any kind of way the kind of patterns that I have in my life. Then part of the universality of this is, of course, wake up, start seeing yourself, So that's the first step. And part of that has to do with starting to confront our instinctual drives. And so there are some needs that at early stages of development, we kind of feed and allow to be, as Russ would say, our lives are temples to our dominant instincts, and we don't even realize it. So we're living inside these temples that have to do with our sexual drives, our desire for belonging, our survival instinct in some kind of way. But we're not even seeing the way in which we're feeding those instincts or also impacting the broader society and contextually questioning any of that. So we need to start working with our instinctual drives. And then the process is we start getting curious about who we are. And that's where the personality Enneagram is incredibly helpful. It helps us to think about why I do things and, do all those wonderful things that the motivation of the type helps us see. And then we develop more and more complex understanding of ourselves as we integrate things like what's the subtype that, when I bring instinct and Enneagram together, how do the wings operate for me, and we build up this picture that helps us to have a colored in version of ourselves. And that's kind of the universal process. And then as we continue with this, and this is where it becomes quite interesting, over time, part of what needs to happen for us is we need to broaden our identities to also include those aspects of ourselves that we deny or avoid. And that's where it gets very different for different types. So the Enneagram 9, that generally is quite magnificent in their capacity to avoid conflict and to kind of suppress anger and turn it into more of an easygoing, passive-aggressive and stubborn nature, all of a sudden wakes up to this backlog of anger, and they become incredibly angry in the same way that the Enneagram 2 that's negated my own needs for years and years and years all of a sudden says, hey, I have needs and it is in some way okay for me to also serve those. They have equal space next to others and I can even accept help. And so I go from being selfless to where some of my system might even judge that quite harshly and say, wow, what happened to that nice giving person? It seems like your boundaries are everywhere at this point in time. And the Enneagram 3 that avoids emotion by being busy gets incredibly sad and starts feeling a lot. So there's a point in the journey where the integration of the denied aspect of a polarity becomes very apparent. And I mean, Jung even wrote about that. And his concept for that was enantiodromia, in which he said that when you have a polarity, and you're only living in one side of the polarity, it is inevitable that the other side will break through at some point in time. First, in small ways into everyday life. And if I still don't pay attention to that, it's a kind of breakdown that allows the breakthrough of that aspect of the polarity to happen.
And is that at point 4 on the process Enneagram that you're referring to there, those behaviours of like the angry 9 and the neat and the selfish 2?
Absolutely. It's at point 4, but what precedes it normally is the breakthrough that happens at the shock point of Enneagram 3. That real, like something's got to give in some kind of way. And then we start allowing the aspects of ourselves that we've denied into our lives.
So it's like the point 1 and point 2, it's where the Enneagram of personality is maybe the most useful because you're making subject, object, you're doing that.
Absolutely.
And also some recognition of where the instinctual priority or sequence is causing problems in life.
And I think that is where most coaches and Enneagram teachers work, is in that early space. Most of the assessments that we work with as well works in the space 1 and 2 around the clock. Whereas once I've gone through the shock point, the formula doesn't fit as nicely. Stereotypes of the Enneagram type descriptions don't fit as nicely. And it's also the point where we need to start working in more idiosyncratic and client-led ways in terms of what's showing up for this individual here. So here we have a fully complex and contradictory human being, no longer an object. We have a real subject that's in frame. And I think that's where sometimes people fall out of love with the Enneagram a bit, because it feels like the Enneagram of personalities tries to put me back into a box that only fits partially. For the individual client, this is one of the places where clients start asking questions like, am I really this type? Or am I maybe another type? Or does it fit at all? So if we can hold the framework in a very different way, where at that point, it's about integrating a denied aspect of a polarity that we've turned been into an either or, and now we're reclaiming as a both and, then there's a very different way in which we can continue to work with it.
I'm thinking about, as you're speaking about friends who I believe are probably at around this level, and I think getting hold of professionals to work with them at that level also becomes more of a challenge, because naturally there are less people around to support these people at this level.
Absolutely. Some of the work that's been done by Talbot and Cook-Reuter in the integral world would say that as few as 20% of people in their lifetimes get to some of those later stages. And if you just think about that, that means like you probably have to look at least 5 coaches to find the one coach that's a bit further along in the journey than I am. And it's much more useful to work with a coach or a therapist that is further along in the journey. Otherwise, it's quite an unsatisfying relationship in some way.
Yeah. What is the priority at that stage? So I know I've seen it mapped as, so this is where we are maybe expressing the higher qualities of the virtue or the heart of our type. So you have the gap, and then at 5, there's where we're doing work on the fixation. Can you speak about that, Lucille? Because I just don't really understand it that well.
So I think the first thing is to say that speak about point 4 as the expression of the higher heart center. I don't think we ever get to the place where we live completely out of the virtue in some way. It's just that the virtue becomes part of our identity. We stretch our capacity and it becomes part of who we are, and our capacity to reach that and to return to that becomes strengthened. But in the higher heart center, part of the space of the heart center has to do with finding, in many ways, my spiritual practices and my spiritual community as well, my community of belonging. That is part of what the heart center represents. Now, we can go on a fairly lonely journey, but it's much harder work. And it's the space where we really start getting benefits in the long run from being disciplined in our practice. So if I have a mindfulness practice, as an example, the more disciplined I am with the mindfulness practice, the more the benefits. The more I'm able to actually loosen the grip of the vice or the passion and live into the virtue. We then continue to move on the Enneagram into that space between 4 and 5. And that space between 4 and 5 is a very tricky and often desperate space. So if we think about the stories in a lot of spiritual traditions, religious traditions, cultural stories as well, there's that space of getting lost in the desert or falling out of the world, out of meaning, into the in-between space. And that's really what 4 and 5 represents, the long, dark night of the soul in some way. And that's the space where I look at the life I've set up for myself and I start questioning the very tenets of my life and the choices I've made up to now. If we think of a life well lived and where development has been a serious part of the journey, traditionally, this would be more or less where the midlife crisis happens.
Right. Yeah.
Now, not all midlife crises are in the space between 4 and 5. In fact, some of them are still at the first stage of the journey where it's all about getting a fancier car and trading in the model of the partner for a fresher, younger version, which is very instinctual, right? But that deep sense of, why have I even chosen this career? Why have I chosen this family? What am I doing with my life? And getting lost almost in the depressive quicksand happens in the space between 4 and 5. We're in the moors of life rather than on solid ground. Point 5 represents the way in which the higher mental center can help us move into a new reality. But we can't actually access the higher mental center without help from spiritual teachers and journey companions that are already further along. And that's what point 6 represents, actually. If you think of Enneagram 6 as a positive shock point, where a spiritual teacher or a guide, you can even think of the spinning dervish Sufi tradition, creates an energetic whirlwind that allows me to rise into the higher mental center. I can't actually, by my own volition, access that level of understanding without some teachers and guides along the way. And the teachers and guides live at point 6. And they pull me up into starting to be able to work with some of the more abstract notions of embracing the holy ideas of our types. So you and I both resonate with Enneagram 4. So that's where we start getting into the place where we know it's not just a mental game, but we know in our bones that it is foolish to even think that we can lose our true selves and our relationship with our true selves, because Holy Origin really represents that sense of knowing that all of creation is holy, and that includes us, and that we cannot lose touch with our essence. We only forget that we are always part of essence, and we can live from that. Part of and getting into that way of looking at the world requires some support, and that comes from Enneagram 0.6.
That's fascinating. So is it that from 4, it's almost from 4 or between 4 and 5 that you need to be sort of magnetized towards 6? It's in that space in order to get to 5. Not that it's about getting to, but in order to progress on the sort of spiritual journey. Yeah.
What sometimes happens is if we don't find those guides that standard Enneagram 6 is we go into the dark night of the soul and then we retreat back into a safer life.
Right. Yeah.
And that happens for many of us because it's just too scary to stay there. And if we think that in a, psychologically in a stage model, the traditional view from psychology is that we spend about 7 to 10 years in a stage. Now, 7 years between 4 and 5 is kind of hard.
Yeah.
I do think that at the moment, there are many ways in which where the world is at is speeding up the developmental process for us in some way. And we don't need to spend 7 to 10 years there left to our own devices. So the sooner we find our teachers, the sooner we can get out of this place that is really quite lost.
Yeah. One more question for you on this before I ask you about how Process Enneagram maps with sort of psychological vertical development models. Are there type-specific reasons why we might linger on certain of those points?
Absolutely. And I think one of the challenges with Enneagram 4 is in particular is that sense that I won't belong to any club that will have me. And that includes the spiritual path. So that sense of feeling that I'm on the outside, even of the communities that offer incredible belonging and meaning to me, can keep the Enneagram 4 stuck. Whereas the Enneagram 3, for example, can get stuck in the journey because I'm just always too busy to do anything outside of work. And if my practices take me into my sadness in particular and my grief and my sense of emptiness, I get busy again. And so that can be part of it. The Enneagram 5's sense that everything in the world should be rational and the belief in the rational can keep me just as stuck.
Yeah.
Because there are many aspects of this journey that are deeply irrational. And live in our instincts, in our gut knowing, in our intuition. And so if I'm trying to find rational proof that I should take the next step in my spiritual journey, I might not take it because it's irrational.
This is why it's useful to have coaches holding the map as a whole, because there are just specific paradigms to break for each type, isn't there, in order to get to the next point. Can we talk about now how does this combine with a map like spiral dynamics, which is the one that I got taught in Integral Method? And even thinking about where spiral dynamic overlaps with Enneagram of Personality has been interesting. But what can you say about how it overlaps with any Process Enneagram view of vertical development?
It's important to acknowledge some of the people that have been bringing those more traditional psychological maps together for years. Like Deb Ooten has been working with spiral dynamics and each of the Enneagram styles at different stages of the spiral for many, many years. And there's real value in it. I do think you can bring the two maps together. For most people, the level of complexity that represents becomes tricky because if we take, spiral dynamics is also a little bit tricky because we keep on evolving more levels, whether it's teal or whatever it would be next now in the spiral. But traditionally, if we take the 8 levels of spiral and we put that on top of the 9 Enneagram styles, we start working with 72 archetypes. Now, that's a lot to hold. So you need people to be at a certain stage of complexity to bring that vertical and horizontal into conversation with each other at the same time. It is possible, but I don't think it is for everyone. I do think that there are many ways in which it is useful to ask the question, yes, Enneagram 6, at what stage? And as we start doing that, I think as coaches, we can work a lot more effectively with our clients, but we might not want to put it all front and center, overtly in front of the client. Some of that's really useful to work with in the background, because if I'm wanting to take a client from stage X to stage Y, I'd be asking different questions and doing different bits of work. So essentially, they don't immediately integrate in some way that doesn't require a bit of cognitive and mental gymnastics. And if as a coach you're able to hold two frames at once, you need to be at a certain stage of development to do that. But if you can hold them at once, you can support your clients in much more of an effective way.
What order would you suggest using these lenses in, Lucille, as a coach? So what's the most important? Do we have Enneagram of personality, Process Enneagram, then spiral, or would it be...
I would not work necessarily with the Process Enneagram and something like spiral dynamics.
Not at the same time.
I'd make a choice. To say, what frame of vertical development are you going to hold? So there are a number of different frames that I might choose to hold. The Process Enneagram is one. So I choose firstly. I do think the sequence is look in the mirror before you try using the map. Because if I can't see myself clearly, what I start doing is a bit of, kind of random target shooting. It's like I draw an X marks the spot that I start from on the map, but it's kind of a random in some way, because I don't know myself well enough to know whether my motivation is Enneagram 6 or Enneagram 7 or Enneagram 8 motivation. I do think there's something useful of looking in the mirror. Once I've looked in the mirror, using the Process Enneagram as a map starts becoming really helpful. And actually, what I've already done by looking in the mirror is I've taken the first step on the Process Enneagram. I just haven't known it yet.
And at least then you can sort of guarantee or be confident that you're a step ahead of whoever you're working with, which you kind of need to be able to support them, right?
From a developmental perspective, yes. Of course, when I'm doing trauma-based work, I can do a good trauma debriefing, regardless of my level and regardless of the level of the person that I'm holding. But when I'm doing specifically developmental coaching, it's really useful to be a step or two ahead.
What have I asked you that would be important to know about the Process Enneagram? I mean, there's so much to learn and know. It's so fascinating. And you teach this, don't you, in among your other things that you do? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So we teach the Enneagram of Process in what we call our level 2 workshop. So level 1 is more Enneagram of personality, level 2 more about the Process Enneagram and other vertical development frames. So we work with some of the identity maturation frames as well. I think the important thing to know is that when we want to work developmentally, we are working longitudinally with our clients.
What does that mean?
Because we don't go through that stage change in an instant. That instantaneous process of a moment of enlightenment, in psychological terms, we'd call that a moment of elasticity, a moment where somehow my consciousness is able to reach and understand things at a much higher level than I normally do. And then I just go back and kick the dog afterwards anyway. So it's just a moment of elasticity. If we want to truly help people shift their paradigms, it's work over time and sticks more if we keep at it rather than trying to have this moment of enlightenment every time we're in a session. Some of it's a hard grind.
Yeah.
And there's so much of an instant gratification culture that we're working in, that people say, okay, I want 3 sessions with my coach and then you should have moved the earth for me. It doesn't quite work like that. You may be able to have those moments of enlightenment, but we're not making a stage change. So yeah, there's a discipline to doing developmental work, and it is about retraining. If we want to get really scientific about it, it's about retraining our brains. So making new neural pathways and new neural connections so that we can start thinking and looking at the world differently. So that's the one thing. I think the other thing that's really important to know is that later stages in the Process Enneagram does not necessarily mean happier. There is something about knowing that as we take in more of the world and we're able to see more of the world and be in relationship with more of the world, we also need to face more anxiety. This the spiritual bypass of if you just do this one thing enough, life becomes wonderful and you never have to think about the problems of the world or your own life again. It's that your capacity to hold the challenges of the world and your own life is increased. But with it, the pain and anxiety that we experience, the existential anxiety here. So it's not all happiness in Denmark. Some of it's really hard. And if what we're interested in is just an easier life, then maybe working with the Process Enneagram will be disappointing.
That's great. So it's not going to make you happier and it's not going to make you more comfortable, but it will make you more lucid.
And more able to respond to the world as it is, rather than the way we wish the world were. And the world is becoming very brittle. And in the brittleness of the world, I think this capacity is going to be called for more and more.
Great, brilliant way to end, actually. Thank you so much, Lucille.
So there we are, friends. I hope that blew your mind as it did mine. In the next episode, I will be talking with Marion Gilbert of the Somatic Enneagram, which is going to be very cool. Please don't forget to subscribe, review, rate, yada yada.